right, so the first thing we're going to need to do here is create a new project, and we'll just use this as a way of getting some practice with arrays. Again, today all I want to do is get you some basic fluency, and we'll talk about how you can practice this later. Okay, so arrays are a way of storing data consecutively. So for example, in your computer's memory, so you might be used to doing things like making individual variables like this. So you'd say you need 3 variables to hold blood pressures or something that's an integer. But what happens if you want to declare 1,000 integers? This could be very tedious. As well, you might not know ahead of time how many you want to ask from Java. So arrays are a way of storing more than one item. And the special thing about arrays is the way it's done is it stores them one piece right after another in the computer's memory. So this is kind of the view you can have with this being the computer's memory. If I ask for, this in Java would say, integer array, and the name of it is scores. And the way you can tell it's an array is by these square brackets here. That's how Java knows it's not just a regular integer. And when you ask for your new integer, you have to say how many you want. So here you could say I want 5 of them. You can also do this at runtime, meaning that does not have to be put in as a fixed number like 5. You could use a variable or something that you read in from the console, but it does not have to be known at compile time. Now, what happens in this example with 5 is it will go to the computer's memory and it will place 5 integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right after another in the computer's memory. So the way you access them is through these same square brackets, where score at 0 is this first slot, then 1, 2, 3, and 4. The same way that strings are indexed, 0-based, and array is also 0-based when you index it. So the way you can ask for these in Java, there's a couple ways that are acceptable. But basically, you start by declaring that you have a certain data type, like for example, integer, double, string, whatever you're working with. It can be any type. And what you're going to get, you give it a name just like you would normally, but you have to use the square brackets. So I kind of prefer this one here myself, though it doesn't really matter which one you like. Because this one, when I read it, it sounds more like what I'm trying to accomplish, because I'd be saying, I have integers, it's an array, it's called my array. Whereas this one is, I'm asking for integers, the variable is my array, oh, and look, it is also an array. So it's kind of like you'd like to know it's an array before you declare the name. But what you should know about, if you have basic data types in Java, that means you'll just end up with slots that hold that basic data type, like integer, double, whatever it is, it'll just stick it in there. And Java generally has a default value. So for example, this just made 5 integers, and it set them all to 0 for me when they're defaulted their starting value. But if you ask for objects, so if you ask for an object in Java and you stick it in an array, it does not make space for the entire object. All that it does is it gives you enough space for an address. Then the addresses are stored in the array. It's much more efficient to do this, but what that means is you're not actually created anything yet when it's an object. All you've done is tell Java you need a place to store them. All those addresses will be set to null. So if you try to use them before you create them, that means you're going to run into trouble because there's nothing there. And we'll talk about how it looks like in an object in a minute here. Another way you can initialize arrays is like this. You can give it the initial values. Instead of telling Java how big the array is, you just use curly braces and Java can figure out what to store in the computer's memory. So that would be the equivalent of taking these numbers and placing them in continuous blocks of memory like this. So as I mentioned earlier, they're 0-based like strings, meaning the first value starts at 0. Here are each of the indexes, and if this is the array right here, these are the values that we have. So when you're working with arrays, you can use them just like you would any other type of variable. So now that I've created space for 5 integers, I can go and say the slot at index 2 is now set to 98, which means Java will go down to this location and put 98 there. Then I can index them from a constant like this at compile time, or you can use variables like I've done here. So this would go to 4, which is that slot, and make it 79. And you can even refer to themselves. So if this is saying take the first item, make it equal to the value at index 3, so that value is 83, and add 5 to it. So that should put 88 into the first slot. So 83 plus 5. Now, knowing that they're 0 based, we run through loops that start at 0 and we don't go past the length of it. In fact, we don't even touch the length. If I know the number of students here is 5, it's going to go from 0 to 4 in this for loop because it's going to stop. It won't ever get to 5 or be allowed to use it since it's strictly less than in this part here. Okay. So what I'm going to show you here is a little bit of Java code that we can try together. And I'll show you a few things that you need to be aware of, as I mentioned, like with objects, creating a null space, as well as they're always passed by a reference, which is important to know about. So if you got your project open, let's build an array. So here's my first array, which I'm going to call test, and I'm going to give you 10 spaces for it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that you can manipulate this array. We can fill it up with some values. So I'm going to create a for loop here that just goes through them. And at the moment, it's just to show you that they're initialized to 0. But what's going to happen is, now that I've created this array, I'm going to loop through the entire thing. And this is a property that all arrays have. It's an important one to know about. Arrays know how much space they have. You can call on it by saying, how long are you? What's your length? So this way, when I run through this loop, even though I know it's 10, it's a good idea, remember, to avoid magic numbers and use that property, test.length. So if I run this, I'm going to get a loop that's going to spit out everything that was put into that array for me. So here are my 10 zeros. Okay. And of course, if we want to, we can go and change those values. I could say, why don't I make this equal to n plus 1. So this is going to now stick the value in the array. It'll no longer be 0. When I run it through, now I'm going to have 10 values, but they go from 1 to 10. So here are the values in that array now. Okay. So all I'm going to do is change this slightly to show you what the difference is. I'm going to change this from integers to strings so you can see the difference with an object. So I'm going to take this code out, and we'll take a look at what happens if I use strings. So far, this looks just the same. And we've asked for 10 strings. But what I had sort of said to you was you won't find anything in there because all it's done is put an address for those strings. It hasn't actually done anything with them. So for example, if I go through this loop, and all I'm going to do is try and find out what's the length of each string. So the length method was one that we used when we first learned about strings. All I'm going to do is go through and ask Java, what's the length of these strings that were just built for me in this array? And if I run my code, the problem right now, and then you see here it's jumped out as a null pointer exception, because when I tried to ask something of a string, it wasn't actually created here. see, there was no string. All it is enough space to hold the address where that string will exist. So it's not actually a string yet. It's just a marker that tells me where to find the string. And again, in later courses when you study memory management, you'll understand this is much more efficient and much more, your software will run faster with this philosophy than if we actually stored new strings in each spot. So I'll slightly alter this just to let you see how I could fix it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take that string and I'll now build memory. Oops, sorry, that should be a K. So because I've now asked Java for a new string, it will create a string somewhere in memory. It will give me an address of where to find it, and it will stick that address in the array for me so that I can find it anytime I want later on. Now, it may not seem like it's much different than from what I did before, but now when I run it, it's not going to tell me I have a null pointer exception. Now it runs happily, and it tells me there's a bunch of strings there, and their sizes are 0, because I didn't put any letters there yet. But I created the memory now that's attached to those addresses. So that's one thing you have to know, and that's true for any object. So objects, you don't get them. You only get an address that points to them. So especially those of you in the advanced placement crowd, that's one of the things in the details of Java that you may encounter when you write your exam. So objects are not created automatically for you. All you get is the address where it's going to be when you're done. So we should be able to do methods on these arrays too, and that's where I'm going to leave us today. We're going to play with a few methods. So these loops that I'm doing here, it's always good programming practice to take your common procedures and make methods out of them. That's what I'm going to do here. So the first one I'm going to do is create a method called print. And all this method's going to do is go through the entire array and spit out what's in it. And I'm going to stick to integers for this example like we started, just to keep it simple. But what I'm going to do here is just make my for loop. And maybe at this point, some of you that really liked using while loops will realize why a for loop is convenient. Because when I traverse through an array, all the pieces that I need to find in the array are up there. Which index do I start at? How far do I go? Keep going from index to the next index to the next index. That's what all 3 lines here say. Right? First index is 0. Keep going until you hit the end of the array. And every time you loop, increment it 1 more index. So all I'll do here is go system.out.println whatever you found at that home. So now I don't need to keep typing these loops. I can instead use my method, but it's only going to work on integer arrays. Okay? So we will do the same thing here. And one of them that I'm going to do is put some random numbers in. So public void fill. As we go on with integers, you'll notice that, with arrays, you'll notice that it's helpful sometimes to have test data. So I'll show you how you can fill your array with some random numbers. So let's just say I have an array and I'd like you to fill them with random numbers from low to high. So maybe this is fill my array with numbers from 1 to 100. So let's write our loop again. And when I burn through my array, and so far I have to apologize a little bit if it seems uninspired what you're doing with arrays so far. All I can tell you is this is our first day, and all I would like you to know how to do is declare them and traverse through them. Anything fancy that becomes useful to us, we will add those skills as we go. But just about every programming language has some mechanism for doing arrays. So whether it's Java or C++, C#, whatever you're going to study in the future, arrays are very important. But today, that's the maximum I'm going to try and stretch your brain this morning is declare one and traverse one. So filling them with a random number, I'll say go in my array to the index I'm on, and I want you to stick in a random number. And if you remember from when we talked about this last, there was a handy way of doing it. But that was our formula for a random number between low and high. I can talk about that one with you individually if you've forgotten how it works. But this will then stick a random integer into my array for me. So now I can say, well, let's make an integer array. And I'll call it rands, as in random numbers. And let's stick in 1,000. So again, if you wanted 1,000 items, until you had arrays to work with, you would have to individually declare 1,000 different integers. But now what I can do is say, please fill my array with random numbers from 1 to 100. And then please print my array. Okay. So with a fairly minimal amount of code, I can operate on 1,000 integers. And if I run it, of course, it's going to be fairly large for my screen. But I should see a bunch of seemingly random numbers from 1 to 100 appearing. And if I scroll through, all 1,000 of them are in there. So all different numbers from 1 to 100. Okay. So that's all that I'm asking that you think about today. For those of you whose first day on arrays, that you be able to declare them and that you be able to traverse through them. We'll talk in a minute here about some of your beginning exercises, but are there any questions about so far what we've talked about in Java? All right.